Hi there and welcome to another episode at Station Road. Now this wee episode is in conjunction with part 1 of the Goodsyard elevation. So this is the video relating to what method I use for installing point motors on the Station Road layout. So without further ado, let's just get into how I do this. So what I'll do now is I'll just show you how I go about installing points on this layout, and there's sort of a specific method that I tend to use, and there are a number of reasons for this particular method, so we'll get into that now. So I thought I'd just quickly show the two different methods of installing solenoid point motors, and the method that I use is this one here on the right. So I actually cut an entire rectangular section out of the baseboard that's big enough for the actual motor to fit through that hole, and then I have this plastic plate over the top, which of course basically stops ballast from falling through when it comes time to ballasting. Now on the left we have the other method, which is basically just a small hole drilled straight underneath where the pin is, and of course big enough for the pin to move backwards and forwards. Now I haven't actually trimmed this pin back, so it's kind of interesting with the rails of Sheffield point motors. The pin definitely needs the extension pin on it, and it's a bit fiddly really, but I'm glad I actually don't use this method, because I can't imagine just how complicated and difficult it would be. So looking at the underside, you can see basically the height difference. So the method I use is this one here, which essentially means really is that you've got a little bit more clearance if you've got another layer underneath your layout. So this is predominantly why I use this method, because I do have a second layer underneath, and in various places there is track that runs underneath and I need this clearance, whereas with this one here it protrudes further down, and even if I clipped these pins off at each end it would still be too deep. So that's really the method I use. And the other main reason too for this method is they're much easier to sort of retrofit a point if you've already laid track, or you've got a pre-existing layout that doesn't have any point motors, and you've got other obstructions under the baseboard, you've got beams, you've got, well, maybe not so much beams, but you know, for example, another layer underneath. There's just simply no way you could install a point motor in this fashion. This type of installation is really, I think, for when you're building a layout for the first time, and with a bit of careful planning you can work out at what point to install the point motors before maybe you build the area in and find it impossible to gain access. Because the problem here, of course, with this type of mount is you have to have access to the underside of the layout regardless, because you've got to mount the screws and do all of those types of things, whereas this method here you don't actually need any access under the layout bar sorting out some wiring, which you can either extend these wires beforehand before you actually set the point into the layout. So, and the pin has fallen out of this, and that's one of the weird things I sort of find with the rails of Sheffield, is the pin is actually just too short. The one that's on the point motor, you have to use the extension, particularly if you've got a thicker baseboard. And I think this is possibly, this here is about I'd estimate possibly a 9 or 10 mil MDF sheet. So, and my baseboards aren't as thick as this. So if you've got a 12mm ply, you have to use these little extension pins, and there's a little brass sleeve that fits in over the top, and it's not that good, to be honest. It has a tendency to fall out. It doesn't actually fit in there nice and tight, and yeah, it's actually a bit of a nuisance. So I am actually really glad that I use this method here. So we'll shift over to the layout, and I'll just show you the process that I use for installing these point motors using this method, and also hooking up the electrical connections, so for the frog and also for the inner rails. So if we just quickly take a look at the rails connect point motor, and as you can see, the pin that protrudes out this side is not very long, and it comes with these two components here as well. So the brass sleeve fits over here, and then the extension pin fits on top of that, but it's pretty wobbly and not very secure. It doesn't fit in there nice and tightly. It just sort of wobbles around. So I don't know, it's not, I don't think, of an ideal solution really. I kind of feel like the brass sleeve actually needs to be longer, because there's just too much flex in that, to be honest. Yeah, that's the issue I sort of think you might encounter with these if you're going the method of mounting it that way up with the pin protruding out. So looking at what I do using the method that I use, I do make some modifications to the point motor. So I cut off the extra tabs on each side, so they're not needed, and it also means that I can reduce the size of the square hole that I need to cut into the baseboard. And then of course on this side here, I remove the central tabs in here, which I believe are for N scale. So rather than folding them down, I actually cut them off altogether. So I just use a Dremel to cut through these components. And then of course the other component that I do trim off as well, so that I can maximize clearance, is I cut the pin on the top. So as you can see, the pin protrudes out on the unmodified version, and then on this one here I cut it right back down, and once again using the Dremel. So looking at the point itself, of course we've got our frog wire poking out here, and then of course in here we've got these two wires connecting the inner rails. So straight out of the box you could just install this as it is and have the electro frog, but you're relying on the connection of these switch rails connecting with the main rails. So hence why I think a lot of people cut these wires here and connect up wires at the other end. Now this is not the point I'm actually using, because I've already actually removed the wires, but I'll just show you sort of roughly how I go about doing this. And there's quite a few YouTube channels that have actually covered this, and we have Charlie from Chadwick Model Railway, there's Everard Junction, Dean Park, just to name a few. So there are many channels that have covered this. So I just get a pair of tweezers in underneath, and usually one end will break away first. You could just use just a very small thin blade screwdriver as well, and then with a pair of pliers pull out the other end. You have to take a reasonable amount of care with this, just to make sure you don't sort of damage anything else. And that's pretty much it. So that's now been cleared. So that's not the point I'm using. I'll switch over to the point that I am using, and as you can see, I've already taken off these cross wires here, and on this particular point it's quite handy. They've already got a clear space, and this is a Pico curved point, so it's a case of soldering wires across those two and across those two, and then you get a solid permanent connection, which means you don't have to rely on the switch rails for the electrical connection. Now, a lot of people will just solder a thin piece of wire across that and then across that, but I actually go ahead and also include it as a pickup point as well for the track. So in other words, it becomes a power feed at the same time. Now, I actually find using these JST plugs a great solution, because basically it means if you ever needed to remove the point for any particular reason, then you can just simply unplug it from underneath. So of course the first thing I do is tin these wires, and that just helps obviously to make the solder connection with the rails much easier and quicker. And it also means that you don't have to put the iron on the rails for too long, which can of course distribute the heat, and then you sort of end up with melted sleepers. So the next step of course is to put 4 wee dobs of solder on the backs of these rails. So there are wee dabs of solder there, and then by now of course I have worked out which wire is which. So I use the method which I think a lot of other modelers use, which is black to back. So wherever you're standing on the layout, the black wire is on the back rail. So looking at where this point is going to be positioned, the black is actually on this side and the red will be on that side. So starting with the black wire, and as you can see, what I've done is bent the wire at right angles, so we've kind of got like 2 little feet, and the feed wire will actually come up through the center, and of course I draw a wee hole in the baseboard for this wire to feed through. So that's what we end up with. So not only have we connected the inner rails to the outer rails for the power continuity through here, but we've also added ourselves a power feed as well to the entire point. So the next wire of course is the frog wire, and they're quite generous with the wire on here, but basically I'll just trim this back to about there somewhere, and for the frog wire I use green, which I think a lot of other people use as well, because frog, as in Kermit the Frog, being green. And this I don't actually solder it. What I actually do is I just simply twist the wires together. I mean, you could solder it, but I just sort of don't worry about it, and then bring the wire up so it's kind of straight up, and then basically I just slip a piece of heat shrink over the top, and slide it over both and push it down, and then it's all nice and secure and it's well insulated. And then I just either run the soldering iron over it or use a lighter, but I'll use the soldering iron while it's still hot. And that's our frog wire. So this point is basically prepared in terms of its wiring, and then the next step is installing the point motor. So what I do, and I showed this sort of previously, is I make out these wee templates. So just a really thin plastic. I actually use, I think it's 150 micron plastic. It's the same plastic that would be used when you're binding a document and you have the clear plastic cover. So originally I used to print this out on the printer and then hand cut out and drill holes, but since I've now got the laser cutter, I just simply laser cut these out and they sort of come out quite well. So the process here is slotting that over the top of the point motor, and of course you get the pin protruding out, and you've got the legs for anchoring the point motor poking through the other holes. And this can be a little bit tricky, but holding the pin underneath, I put it in one of the positions, and I've also got to consider where the wiring is going to go. So sometimes I actually clip the cable tie off here so that I can sort of free up the wire a bit better. But I think we will put the point motor that way around in this situation and make sure our pin is vertical. And switch the point to the same position, and then I just sort of line it up until I've got that pin poking through. So we can now see the pin is poking through into the tie bar there. So, and then it's just a case of twisting these pegs, and I usually just give them a 45-degree twist. So that is the point motor installed to the point, and the point is essentially ready now. So we've got all our feeds, and I'm just check to make sure that that switches freely, which it does, and we can now move over to the layout and pop it in. So when it comes to actually cutting the rectangular hole, I have this piece of plastic here which is a template for marking out the cut for the hole. This of course is the plate that goes on top of the point motor and underneath the sleepers. So as you can see here, the hole for the baseboard is obviously smaller than the plate, so that plate will actually spread out beyond the edges of the hole. So once you've found the position for your point and you know exactly where it's going to go, then essentially what I do is slide this plastic template underneath where the whole point motor mechanism will actually be, and sort of generally kind of line it up by eye so you've got an even amount of space around this whole component here, and then mark out the actual area with a pencil or pen, and that's the shape, that's the hole that needs to be cut. Now I use the Dremel to cut this, but before I had the Dremel, of course I would drill a hole in each corner just with a drill, and then either cut with a saw, like a thin saw, or if your baseboard's quite thin, you could use a craft knife, or if you're not too worried about mess, you could drill these holes a bit bigger and actually jigsaw cut this hole out. So there's a number of ways that it can be cut out, but I'd much prefer the Dremel does a nice, reasonably tidy job. So this is where our point is going to be positioned, and I've pre-cut the rectangle for the point motor. We've got our power feed and then our frog wire down here. So we'll just slot this into place, and our frog wire goes in through here, and then we've got our power feed, and then our point motor in there, and that's basically it. So as you can see, I'm able to install this point with the point motor, electro frog with power feeds without having to get underneath a layout and mount a point motor from the other side, which would have been impossible in this situation because there's just no access really underneath this. So I could have done it, because this of course at the moment is still a lift out section, but I'm quite happy with this method. And of course, as you can see, because I put this clear plastic plate over the top of the point motor, it just means that you haven't got this gaping great big hole in here, and I can actually ballast reasonably close right up to around here. And that's one of the reasons I use plastic as opposed to card or anything like that. This is really thin plastic, so it's not really going to affect any bowing in the track. And when it comes to ballasting, of course, it's not going to degrade or anything like that when you soak the ballast with the glue mix. So that's the method that I use for installing point motors, and it certainly seems to work quite well for the station road layout and the sort of peculiar nature of how I've built it. So as I mentioned at the beginning, this does relate to the part 1 video for the Goodsyard elevation. So there's a link up in the top corner for that video as well.